Hello, welcome everyone to our September Test Talk. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Kayla Holloway and I'm Assistant Director of Alumni Programs here at TWU. We are excited to get this fireside chat started tonight, but before we begin, I want to point out the chat function. The chat function is utilized to communicate to the panelists and the staff members. So if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please be sure to send it via that chat. You may have to log into a Google or YouTube account, so please be aware of that. We will be monitoring this chat throughout the presentation and ask any questions you have during or at the end of the chat during the Q&A. Now, before I introduce our guests, we are going to show a short video to get the event started.
The interesting thing about research in these kinds of environments is that there's really just not a lot of it. And a lot of what there is from old military studies. In research, they often like to say that women are kind of like smaller men, and I think that can be pretty misleading because we have much different hormonal levels and things like that that affect things as simple as body temperature and body composition. So for me, as a scientist and a woman, I was really kind of just wanting to get some data, even if it's just from me initially, but something that can shed some light on that area of research that's kind of lacking right now.
So for the last 7 years, I've been on a journey to complete the 7 summits, and in the process gather as much data as I can to better understand how we can perform in these extreme environments. My last and final objective was to summit Vincent Massif in Antarctica. What I didn't expect was how long and difficult that trip would ultimately be.
On one particular day, it was about -40 with wind chill, and taking your glove off can mean frostbite within minutes. But yeah, I'd just never been in that kind of cold before, so it was pretty intense and kind of scary really, because you feel your fingers or your toes going numb, and you're like, oh God, could this be the beginning of frostbite? And how do I fix it and quickly? Because it's not like you're going to get out of the elements in any sort of way. You're just really out there and exposed, and there's nothing around, absolutely nothing.
The Vincent Expedition 2020. It's the 5th of January, and we're here at High Camp. There's this massive storm coming in off the Amundsen Sea, moist, wet air. And there's a lot of fetch as that wind howls across the flats of Antarctica and then hits Sentinel Mountains.
We attempted to summit today. It looked like it might have been good weather for us because we knew there was some pretty brutal stuff blowing in. We got about 3/4 of the way up, hit the final ridge line, and it just started nuking on us, and winds were basically knocking me over at that point. Zero visibility, so made the smart decision to descend to safety. Even still, we did have some cold injuries on the team, unfortunately, some frostbite. It is what it is. We took a gamble. Weather decided to not be in our favor today, and that's what happens. I've definitely not given up, and if there's another opportunity to go up, I'm absolutely going to take it. So, what do I think of the weather?
Yeah.
It's a pretty dramatic shift from yesterday, I'd say. It's like calm and sunny and perfect.
Yeah, feels like a summit day to me.
To think that it's all over, that my journey of climbing the 7 summits has come to a close. In a way, it makes me sad, but ultimately all of this has driven me to push myself harder and to reach further than I ever thought possible. I'm not sure where my path will lead next, but I do know that if my research can pave the way for a generation of young women to become scientists or explorers and chase their dreams to the furthest reaches of the earth, I just don't think there'd be any greater feeling than that.
Wow, such an inspiring video, and it's a perfect way to segue into introducing our guests for this evening. So first, we have Roxanne Vogel, who is the Nutrition and Performance Research Manager at GU Energy Labs, where she oversees the Performance Lab and works with elite athletes to optimize nutrition for performance, health, and longevity. She is a PhD candidate in exercise physiology at Southern Cross University, Australia, where her research focuses on nutrition interventions to support human performance in environmental extremes, including heat, cold, and hypoxia. A mountaineer and ultra endurance athlete, in 2019, she became the first person in history to summit Mount Everest door to door in 2 weeks, and in 2020, completed the 7 summits by successfully climbing the highest peak on each continent. She has spent the past decade researching nutrition and its impact on body composition, performance, and cognitive function. Roxanne currently resides in the mountain town of Mammoth Lakes, California. So welcome, Roxanne.
Thank you.
And then our next guest is Dr. Nancy DiMarco. She is a professor emerita of the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at Texas Women's University and the former director of the Institute for Women's Health, where she also directed the Exercise and Sports Nutrition Master's Program from its inception in 1993. In addition, she developed the Pioneer Performance Clinic in 2006 as a place for graduate students in the ESN program to develop their hands-on skills in sports nutrition, working with actual athletes and clients from the community. Her educational background was completed primarily in molecular biology and biochemistry, but she took a course in nutrition during her doctoral studies and changed her emphasis to nutrition. Her avocation as an athlete and runner developed into a desire to combine her two passions, nutrition and exercise, into a program that was the third program in the nation, the Exercise and Sports Nutrition Master's Program. It became one of the premier programs in the country and attracted students from all over the world. In addition, she was instrumental in developing the national credential and testing within the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics to accredit dietitians with the Certified Specialist in Sports Dietetics. She resides in Denton and is a former marathoner and an avid CrossFitter for 12 years. So welcome, Dr. DiMarco.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And at this time, we are happy to have them, and I'm going to let them take the show.
Great. Well, thank you to both Kayla and Chelsea for getting us started, but mostly thank you to Roxy, who made this program possible tonight. And I want to begin by just asking Roxanne a very important question, and that's about the title of your presentation. Why did you choose it?
Well, if you could go ahead and throw up the first slide we have there. So as a kid, I used to love these books that I would read, and they were called Choose Your Own Adventure series, and they had all these different topics. The one you see here is just one that I picked because it resonates with me nowadays. But essentially, you could start reading it, and then you would come to sort of a fork in the road, and you would get to choose either one choice or another. And then depending on which one you chose, you would flip to that section. And so the story would be different depending on which path you took. So for instance, you could decide to ford the dangerous, tumultuous river crossing, or you could instead choose to, seek another crossing point further up the trail. But so this has been kind of similar in a lot of ways to how my life and career has progressed to this point. I seem to come to these junctures where there's like a fork in the road and there's choices to be made. And I feel like I tend to take the path less traveled in a lot of situations, but obviously it's led me to where I am now. So I have no complaints about that.
So you very much successfully individualized your journey. I want to start by asking you a little bit about your educational background before graduate school. You want to tell us about that pathway?
Yeah, so I actually started off in a sports med program, and I got into Pepperdine University right out of high school, and I thought that was exactly where I wanted to be, and the perfect program, the perfect location, not far from where I grew up in San Diego, California. And I got to Pepperdine and within 3 weeks decided that it really wasn't the place for me. Not to knock their program or the campus was beautiful and all that, but I just didn't feel like I personally fit in there. So I ended up switching schools, moved to North Carolina, and finished my first bachelor's degree there in communication media. So totally switched my focus too. And then, started working in radio. Oddly enough, I was really into music, hence the communication degree. And within a couple years of being in the music industry, I guess I decided I still felt like I was missing something. Was really into my own training and decided to become certified as a personal trainer, and that really renewed my interest in the whole sports medicine field. And I decided to go back to school for a second bachelor's, which I got in North Carolina, and then decided to focus on, going and furthering my education from there. And it was in my second bachelor's degree program where I did my first research study that I got funded. And, that really lit a spark underneath me, and research became just the thing I really wanted to do. And so obviously grad school was the next option for me. So, yeah, two bachelors in very, very different things. One was in communication media, one was in human performance and sport. And then obviously the master's came later in exercise and sports nutrition.
Yeah. I often have told my students that going through graduate school, you oftentimes find out what you don't want. And that is almost as important as finding out what you do want. I have another question for you, Roxy, and that is, have you always been an athlete?
If you talk to my family, they would say absolutely not. So I grew up, I was always active and I always played sports recreationally. So I played soccer, softball, field hockey. I grew up in San Diego, so I went to the beach a lot as a kid. But I was never really driven as a competitive athlete by any means. I just did it more for fun to, move around and be around other kids. And then I think it was during college really that I started running as a way to just manage the stress of being in school and whatnot. And that's when I started entering into road races. So like I did my first 5K when I was living in North Carolina, and then I wanted to do a half marathon, and now it's progressed obviously, and I'm doing ultra marathons and things like that. But yeah, I think that's where I really caught the bug as far as being more of a competitive and serious athlete was in college.
For sure. Well, I want to change gears just a little bit, and I'd like to talk about the research that you did prior to coming to TWU.
Yeah. So there was a brief bit of time when I was in between my second bachelor's and then coming to TWU for my master's, when I started working as a research assistant, actually, when I was living in Colorado, and I started working for a company that made sports nutrition products.
Mhm.
And so a lot of our research at the time when I was working in that lab focused on ingredients that could help athletic performance, different types of training modalities, and things that would affect body composition. So whether that was through sports nutrition products or through diet or through different methods of training. And so we did a bunch of studies, especially in-house. We had this great training facility, and there you can kind of catch a glimpse of what it was. And so we had our labs attached to this giant, it was like a gym essentially. So we would have folks come in and do the studies, and we would supervise them from our lab, and they would train with us for whether it was a 4-week study or an 8-week study, or in some cases even 12 weeks. We would have them come in to do the training protocol, and we'd be giving them supplements or placebo, for instance, and we would test them in the beginning, we would test them in the middle and at the end, and see whether the training and or supplement made a difference as far as their performance, their body composition. So, how much lean mass or muscle they gained or how much fat they lost, things like that. So it was really exciting times, and again, just furthered that desire to do research, and especially in the field of sports nutrition.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and they had these environmental chambers. So very, very cool. Tell us a little bit about what happened at this company that caused you to leave.
Yeah, so it was a great job, and I thought for sure I had found my place in life, and that was where I wanted to be. I was living in Colorado, so I was near mountains, and then I had this great job as a research assistant, so doing the things I wanted to be doing. But unfortunately, as so many things happen in life, just changes were inevitable, and we ended up downsizing the company, or they ended up downsizing the company, and so very much cut all of the funding for the research we were doing. And so at that time I had to find a new path, which was scary, and not something that I was necessarily prepared for in the moment. But I started looking into grad schools, as I knew that I really did want to get my master's, and that's how I ended up finding TWU, and saw the Women's Institute for Health and Pioneer Performance Clinic. And then the ESN major itself was just so unique at the time. And I knew that that was a really special thing to be able to combine both the nutrition aspect and then the exercise physiology part of it. So I knew that was where I wanted to be.
Yeah. And our research was very similar as well. And I'm sure that also attracted you.
Yeah, at the time you were working with a group called Dymatize, who makes sports nutrition products similar to the company I had been working with at Muscle Farm. So it was very, very close and an easy transition for me to make at the time.
And having your name on the door didn't hurt either, right?
Yeah.
So how did you let me back up. You've had some really unique experiences and a tremendous career. How do you think that TW prepared you for that journey?
Yeah, I think number one is just getting to do research, and out of that research get publications, because I think if you want to be a researcher, that's really important for potential employers, or for universities, if you're looking to further your studies and continue on like I have to start your PhD program. So it's just so important to get that hands-on experience, and we were definitely able to do that. So I was a graduate research assistant, so I was directly involved in research, and that was my primary focus there. So I didn't even end up doing any TA work. I was just doing research hours, which was great. And then I think the other part that was key was the through the Pioneer Performance Clinic, which was on site at TWU. We had the whole sports nutrition practicum program. And so my practicum placement was with the MLS team, or the Major League Soccer team, FC Dallas. And so again, just another really good hands-on experience for me as a graduate student, but something that, even now in my career, I work with professional soccer teams, and I can go back to that experience and be like, oh, well, here's what I learned when I was working with this team. And so yeah, it's just those kinds of real world experiences that you can't really get in a lot of other universities, I think.
Yeah. That experiential component was such an important component when we designed the program, because we didn't want our students to graduate and not have had some real life experience with real people, real athletes, real clients. So I'm glad you had that experience.
Yeah.
I also want to ask you a little bit about let's see. I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit more about your the research you actually did at TW.
Yeah. So when I was there, we worked primarily on looking at different forms of protein supplementation. So if you think of protein supplements on the market, you typically see those powdered protein supplements like whey proteins, which is a milk protein. And now there's a lot of plant-based proteins and things like that. But when I was there, we were looking specifically at different forms of whey protein. So whether it was a more highly broken down type called hydrolyzed, or if it was a more complete intact protein known as a whey protein concentrate, and how that affected both the absorption and then the effects on, say, metabolism. So whether that increased your resting metabolism so that you burn more calories, or whether it didn't have an effect. And so my particular thesis was looking at that metabolic effect of the different types of whey protein. And we did find that the hydrolyzed, or the more highly broken down form, did increase your calorie burn just at rest, which was a pretty neat finding. So
Yeah, it was
yeah.
great. And that research is continuing to this very day, and they're still looking at different types of protein. So very cool. You kind of laid the groundwork for that research. I'm going to switch gears here, Roxy, and I would like us to start talking about your GU Energy Lab and how you got the job.
Yeah. So I like to say it's my dream job. But so I was finishing up my master's degree at TWU, and I got a call from the HR person at GU Energy Labs, and they told me that they were creating a new position as a sports nutritionist that hadn't been previously filled before, and they wanted me to interview for it. And so I went through several rounds of interviews, flew out to California. They're headquartered in Berkeley, California, so in the Bay Area. So I flew out for an in-person interview, which was, really exciting and terrifying at the time. And I mean, to be honest, I felt like I wasn't adequately prepared for that role, but they ended up offering me the position. And so I accepted in my last semester of coursework at TWU, and ended up moving directly to California in January of 2017. So even before I was officially finished with defending my thesis, but it couldn't have been a more perfect role. And, it ended up really evolving with me as I came into that role, because it was a new position, and nobody else had really made it their own yet. So, yeah, I've been there now for, going on almost 5 years. It will be.
Amazing.
And yeah, so it's continued to change. So I started as a sports nutritionist, and my title now is currently nutrition and performance research manager. So I've added some responsibilities, and kind of, again, just grown into these new roles that we've found are part of the job. So
I'll never forget your thesis defense. Roxy was one, I think you were the first person that I had who defended their thesis via Zoom. I think it was Zoom or whatever it was.
I think it was pre-Zoom. I think this was
Zoom.
Skype.
There we go. Yeah, but she was in California, and her whole committee was here, so she had to do it via pre-Zoom. It was awesome. Tell us what your job at GU looks like day to day.
Yeah. And right now, I'll be honest, it's a little different than it has been in the past few years, just because we're all still working remotely, as you can tell by my lovely background here. But I would say that normally it breaks down into about, 4 different categories that I spend my time doing each day. So we have what's called the performance lab, which is where I help to test new product concepts with our athletes. And, that's where we do our research. So we have a small physiology lab on site that we can do VO2 max and resting metabolic rate and things like that with our athletes. So that's one component. Another component is attending events and doing educational talks and seminars, as you can see pictured here. This is one of our bigger events called Sea Otter, where it's a cycling event, and there's thousands of athletes that come, and we'll do nutrition clinics and talks and things like that. Another 25% of what I do is product development. So I work within the research and development department. So whether it's coming up with new product ideas, researching ingredients that might be included into new products, or even reformulating our existing products to either make them better or just, change some of the ingredient profiles. That's also something I do on a daily basis. And then finally, we do have a team of sponsored athletes. So I work directly with them for sports nutrition. So planning their event specific nutrition or even just daily nutrition, counseling, things like that. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell.
Everything that a sports nutritionist dreams about, I think you get to do on a daily basis.
I think, yeah. And I think honestly, the most exciting thing has been the performance lab. So this was something that we sort of created when I stepped into the role, and we got the equipment and to be able to run these sort of tests, metabolic tests and things like that on our athletes in-house. And so that's really our testing ground, where we have these case studies and projects and a whole process that allows us to come up with products and test them in the field, collect data, and then, learn from those experiences, and that will help inform our future innovation strategy. So it's really fun. It's a lot of research and product development, but also problem solving.
So a lot of the same equipment we used in the Pioneer Performance Clinic,
Yep.
you put to use there. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you think the pandemic has affected your work and also your PhD research?
Oh, yeah. So I started my PhD work in 2020. So right after I finished up in Antarctica, I was down there for 5 weeks. I flew to Australia to start my PhD. And, within 2 months of arriving there, the pandemic was officially declared, and Australia closed its borders to international travelers, and since then has not reopened them. So I've been doing my work remotely, both for GU and for Southern Cross University. So it's been interesting. I've been also managing a research study remotely. So in the US, conducting research overseas in Australia, but also doing an arm here domestically in the US. And so it's been a challenge, but it's been a good learning experience. And I'm just really keeping my fingers crossed that they're going to reopen the borders soon so that I can go back and be able to be amongst my peers and take advantage of some of the facilities and things that we have there on campus too.
For sure. I can't imagine what a challenge this has been to continue your research and yet have to be here all the time. We're going to switch gears again, and I want us to start talking about summiting. And the first question I'm going to ask you is, what was your inspiration for becoming a mountain climber?
Yeah, that's another one of those fork in the road stories for me. So if you go back to 2012, I guess, I was living in North Carolina at the time. I had been married and was going through a divorce. And so I decided that the best thing to do for me at that time would be to go out and travel and be on my own. And so I decided to go to Nepal and hike up to Everest Base Camp. And so, I get there and I get to base camp and I'm looking up at the Himalayas, which are just huge and looming and so beautiful. And that was pretty much the moment when I was like, yep, I want to go up there. And so I came back from that trip. I was supposed to be actually attending grad school in North Carolina, which I gave up that, moved to Colorado and started, as the research assistant there. But I moved to Colorado so I'd be able to train and climb mountains in preparation to start climbing around the world. So it was really a turning point, and it was a huge risk. And I'm sure my parents were devastated at the time that I was just going to up and leave North Carolina and my life behind to start something new. But it worked out, and that's how I started climbing.
So what gave you the inspiration to do the 7 summits? That's always intrigued me. And I think it's so incredible that you've accomplished it, because not that many women have that behind their name.
It wasn't the plan from the outset. And even when I was sitting there, at Everest Base Camp and looking up at the mountain, I didn't think I would ever come back and actually summit Mount Everest. I just thought the mountains were amazing and beautiful themselves. I think it just became part of the plan as I went. So I started by climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, was the first of the 7 summits, and that's because I knew somebody who had done it and said it was incredible, and so I decided to climb it. And then, from there it was like, well, what's the next highest mountain I can climb? And that ended up being something down in South America called Aconcagua. And so
Mhm.
it was also on the 7 summits list. And so I was like, oh, well, this is kind of turning into a trend. Maybe I should just keep going and see how many of these I can climb. So just
Wow.
happened.
Could you tell us the scariest experience you've had climbing?
Yeah, so I think probably the closest call and the scariest moment I've had on mountain was when I was climbing Everest and summit day. We were getting to the final approach to the summit, which is a pretty steep snow slope, and there's these lines that have to be put up, so it's ropes, and they affix them to the mountain so that you are clipped into something that's attached to the mountain in the event that you fall or something like that. You're still somewhat attached. um, we were getting up there, and um, so it was myself and my climbing partner Lydia Brady, and then two climbing Sherpa with us. We got onto the line, and the anchor that was holding it onto the mountain came loose, and then we, as our weight was on it, so we kind of started to tumble, um, and it was a really scary moment where it was just like, if you keep going, you're going to just go off the mountain. But luckily, we were able to self-arrest in that situation, which means, you dig in with your crampons, which are spikes so that you can get purchase on the snow, and you have your ice axe and everything, and rescued the situation. But it was pretty scary, and it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in those ropes that are fixed going even higher. You're just like, well, I hope everything else is good and secure up there. So yeah.
Wow. Well, we're going to move into Everest at this point because I think that's what our audience is waiting to hear. This incredible experience that you now have the world record in. How did you prepare for that climb?
Well, it was a long process, and I did it a little bit differently than I think most people who train to climb Mount Everest do. So, to put it into context, most folks who go to climb Mount Everest, it takes about 2 to 3 months of being away from home, being on the mountain, or in Nepal or China, depending on which side you climb from, because it takes that long to really get your body acclimated to the high altitude. So your body has to adapt, and it just takes a long time, and it's a fairly fairly long, drawn out process. But I wanted to see if we could do that in a shorter amount of time. So in this case, 14 days, which had never been done, and I think the next closest had been like 28 days was the
Mm.
shortest that it had been done in. Um, so it started a good year before I even got onto the mountain. So a year before, in 2018, I started training by doing a lot of ultra marathons. So I was running a lot of long miles. An ultra marathon is anything over the traditional 26.2 mile distance. So these are mostly on trails, but doing an ultra marathon every few weeks just to get a really strong aerobic base. I went down to climb some high peaks down in Ecuador in November. And so this was the first time I used a hypoxic training system. So it simulates high altitude, and you essentially breathe in less oxygenated air, and that helps you to acclimatize while you're still living at whatever elevation you're at. So for me, it's at sea level when I was living in Berkeley. And so I tested this protocol out, and it seemed to work. I went up to at least 20,000 feet with no problem in a rapid ascent style. So pretty quickly. And then the real strict training began in January of that year. So I was planning to summit in 2019. And this is when I essentially started making sure my diet was on point, making sure my training was really focused on the climbing components. I started sleeping in an altitude tent you can see there. That was my room, and that's my bed in the tent that I slept in every night for 3 months, eventually getting it up to about 20,000 feet of simulated altitude. I also was fortunate enough to, through work, have a altitude chamber at the headquarters. So in our gym, you can see there on the left, we had a small room that was dedicated as an altitude chamber where we could do work at a stand-up desk. We could put bikes in there and do some training in there as well. I put a step-up box in there so I could do my step-ups with a weight vest. But so I essentially started living in a simulated high altitude environment for at least 12 hours a day was the goal, every day for those 3 months before I left. And on top of that was training about 20 hours a week, just with doing lots of stairs, wearing weight vests, and doing, hill climbs and repeats and things like that. Lots of hiking, obviously, and lots of strength training. So we started to create new products to specifically help me get up the mountain. So we created a range of different energy gels, drink mixes, and even an Everest bar that would give me the calories I needed and the different macronutrients, so carbohydrates and proteins and fats, specifically for this event. My team at GU was instrumental, obviously, in helping me pull this all together. We did a lot of testing in the endurance lab or in the performance lab. And so, that's me doing a VO2 max and also a metabolic flexibility test to see what kind of calories I was burning, how many calories I was burning, and, whether I needed to be taking in more carbohydrates or more proteins or fats, things like that. And then you can see, obviously, I had to log a lot of vertical feet. So you can see the chart in the middle is how much vertical feet I climbed over time from starting out in December in 2018 and then leading up to right before I left. And so by the time I finished, I was climbing up to 26,000 feet in a week. And so if you think of Everest as being 29,000 feet, that's almost the height of Mount Everest that I was climbing in a week. So some good training. And there on the right, you can see that tiny little speck is me climbing up a snow slope with a 65-pound pack. So that was part of the specific training for this climb, but it was a lot of fun. So I knew I had to be ready. I didn't have an exact date for departure because it was all very weather dependent. So I had people on the ground in China as I was climbing from the Tibet side who essentially called me and said, you need to book a ticket now, time to go. And so I was ready as of May 1st, bags packed and just waiting. And then on May 7th, I finally got the call and they said, book your flights. May 10th, I took off from San Francisco. I arrived in Tibet 2 days later at base camp and drove directly to 17,000 feet. So this is the point where it's like, if that hypoxic training hadn't worked and I got to 17,000 feet within 1 day of leaving sea level, we would have been in big trouble. But it did work. I felt fine. So we started up the mountain, climbing progressively higher, got to 21,000 feet a few days later at advanced base camp. Then finally made it into the death zone. So that's above 25,000 feet. You put on your oxygen at that point. You can see our camp perched pretty precariously there on the side of the mountain. Pretty spectacular views though. And then, on May 22nd, we had a weather window to climb. And so we were on, again, the north side from Tibet, and we were the only people to attempt that day. And so it was just the four of us, myself, my guide, and two climbing Sherpa. We set out at about 1:45 in the morning from close to 25,000 feet at Camp 2. And 10 hours later, made it to the summit. And we were the only ones on the summit that day, which was completely surreal and happens to be the same day that the picture was taken that went viral of the south side and that lineup, that conga line of all the climbers waiting to get to the top. We managed to not hit any of that, which was miraculous. Had the summit to ourselves, descended back down, and 16 hours later, made it to my Camp 2, got down to base camp the next day after 12 more hours, got picked up immediately, driven to the airport, and within 2 days of summiting was back in my home on May 24th, just 14 days later. So.
Wow. Did you have any problems with the adjustment coming back down? I know, and I said this before, that people who have gone deep sea diving and then they immediately get into a plane oftentimes suffer from the bends. Did you have any kind of physiological response coming down from altitude?
Yeah, we were definitely concerned about that because there is a big pressure difference in being at high altitude and being at sea level. And so I did wear compression stockings just for my legs and things like that during the flight and travel home. I didn't end up having any adverse outcomes. And I part of this was done for research. So I did collect data. I used this like really cool space grade wearable garment that took all of my vital signs for the whole climb. So it did like blood pressure and HRV and body temperature and just so many things, which is it's really cool project on itself. And yeah, I didn't even end up losing any lean mass or any mass at all, which was the most miraculous part, I think, because on summit day, I know I've told you this, Dr. DiMarco, before, but like it was the first time I had worn an oxygen mask. And so it made it really difficult to want to eat or drink anything because then you had to stop and like pull down the mask and fiddle with things. And so I ate very little on summit day in 16 hours and similarly the next day. And I was amazed that I hadn't lost more mass or muscle mass because people who go to climb and are there for 2 or 3 months will typically lose like
Yeah,
20 pounds.
tremendous. Yeah, exactly. So I think what you have proven is that not only can it be done, but it can be done with minimal impact on the body. So I hope you're going to publish all of this, Roxy, because it really is incredible. I
Yeah.
have a really crazy question, but what did you do about brushing your teeth or washing your face at How do you take care of yourself when you're at high altitude?
Oh, yeah, it's, you still do all of those things and it's just a little bit more inconvenient at times. And especially like for instance in Antarctica when the weather can be really, really bad or negative 40 degrees or winds are howling and there's zero visibility, you end up just doing a lot of things in your tent. So it's like you're brushing your teeth in your tent, you use like a bottle to expectorate in, definitely a separate bottle than your drinking bottle. But yeah, so you find ways.
Interesting. Amazing. Well, we're gonna wrap this up and we're gonna talk about all the lessons that you've learned on your journey. Um, Tell us about what you've learned.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is always to walk away and reflect on the lessons that you've learned along the way. Um, Obviously, I'm still very young in my career, but I do feel like I've got some pretty good lessons. First of which is having great mentors, such as yourself and these other two powerful ladies pictured on screen, Magda Boulay, who's my current boss, and Irene Rubin, who was one of my first mentors and encouraged me to go far in my educational career. So these people will take an investment in you and help you, find the right path and just be in your corner when you have those self-doubts that can get in the way of progress. I think having solid mentors is one of the most important things. Be agile, so be ready for change. And if you expect change, then it'll never catch you off guard. I think that's been a really good lesson for me, especially with things like being laid off. That can happen anytime. But if you're ready and resilient and able to just pick up and keep moving, then you'll be in a good position. Um, and then the last one here is finding comfort in discomfort. And that's to say, if you're too afraid to go and like take that chance or apply for that job you might not be qualified for or reach out to that researcher whose work you admire, then you might be missing something, you might be missing an opportunity. And also that sometimes discomfort can be, well, yes, uncomfortable, but it's also just you kind of stretching your own boundaries and taking you to that next place. And so I think it's always a good sign to be a little bit uncomfortable. And
One of
then
my, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think number one lesson that I've learned is to follow your passion, because motivation comes and goes, but if you are doing what you love, like, it will just get you through all of those tough times. And um, honestly, like, my work and what I do now is so tied with what I love to do that there's a saying that
Not
if you
work.
love what you do, yeah, you'll never work a day in your life. And that's very much how I feel. It's just been such a blessing to be able to focus on things that I would be focusing on in my free time anyways. And that's what I get paid to do. So
I used to have a sign in my office that said, change is good. A lot of people fear change, and you've certainly not feared it, but embraced it. And I think that's such a tribute to your personality. And the other thing that I see is that you've just been so positive about everything that life has thrown at you, and you've overcome obstacles, and you've made those incredible choices. So we are all just so inspired by this journey, and truly inspired. So I want to just end it by talking about what's coming up next for you.
yeah, well, as we've seen through this pandemic, it's anyone's guess what's next. But I think the tentative plan for right now is to finish my PhD work, hopefully be able to return to Australia and get some of that research done on site there. And in my climbing world, the next objective is the North Pole. So it would be to complete all of the 7 summits, and then the North and South Pole is known as the Explorer's Grand Slam. And so very few people have done that set of objectives, and so I've just decided that that would be my next goal. So that, and then I think my next big area of interest is outer space. So to be continued.
Holy moly. That is incredible. So maybe you'll be on one of Elon Musk's SpaceX flights coming up. We just saw
Or
the first
or doing research. I mean, I think just
yeah.
astronaut physiology is fascinating, and it
Oh, it
overlaps a
is.
lot with the things that I research. So
Truly.
the heat and cold and hypoxia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
truly. That is so amazing. Well, we are at the end of this presentation, but we are going to take questions and hopefully provide you some answers. We'd love for you to ask away. Our first question is, prior to climbing your first tall mountain when you were training, was there a turning point when you realized you had the stamina to complete those climbs?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think when I first realized I was able to do kind of long, strenuous tasks, I was down in Peru. And as part of my first undergraduate degree, I studied abroad down there, and we did the Inca Trail trek to Machu Picchu. And so that was my first real like backpacking experience. And we spent, I think, 4 or 5 days on the trail, and you go over a 14,000-foot pass, which was the highest I had ever been. I mean, I grew up at the beach. Like, we were not a camping family or anything like that. And so, I trained for that experience. And then after I completed it, I was like, wow, I am really capable of doing these things and going to these heights. And I think that was kind of the turning point for me.
Yeah, awesome. That's on my bucket list, Roxy. I want to go to Machu Picchu.
Oh, so
and
cool.
I want to walk. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Highly recommend.
Definitely. Other questions. Sarah Deemer. Hi, Sarah. You're my hero, Roxy. I think I remember reading when you were also consuming exogenous ketones during your summit trip. What role do you think they played with your maintenance of muscle mass? Roxy's a former, I should say, Sarah's a TW grad, exercise physiology, got her PhD, went to University of Alabama, Birmingham, and now she's on the faculty at UNT. So we're all big fans of Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for the question. It's so good to see you here. Yes, I was supplementing with exogenous ketones. So I was taking the HVMN variety, for those of you who are familiar with exogenous ketones. Um, I was mostly honestly taking them for the purported cognitive effects. As many people know, when you go to high altitude, or many people may have experienced, when you go to high altitude, your cognitive processes are not quite as sharp as they are at sea level in many cases. And so I was trying to see if taking the ketone esters, which was the HVMN, would help me with my mental acuity, my mental sharpness, focus at high altitude. So I did some experiments with these. They kind of feel like brain games, and it was on my iPad that I could take them at altitude. So I would take the ketone esters, do the brain games, and see how it compared to when I would take when I would not take the ketone esters. Absolutely, there could have been a role in preservation of lean mass and recovery. I wasn't looking specifically at that outcome, and so it's hard to say whether or not for sure there was an effect. But great question, and thank you for being here.
Irene Diggs asks, what type of record did you set with your amazing Everest climb?
So it's not going to be in the official Guinness World Book of World Records, because you can't have the exact same start and finish point as I flew from my house to Everest and back. But it is the fastest, door to door and sea level to summit and sea level climb of Mount Everest. So, yeah.
And it's probably one that's not going to be broken anytime soon.
We'll see. There's always people who are reaching out and asking how it's been done, and
Yeah.
if they could maybe do similar things.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
yeah.
Michael asks, if you can beat any other record, what would it be?
Ooh.
Great
I
question.
think probably it would be to be the gosh, my parents, if they're watching, are going to be so angry. Probably to be the first woman to walk on Mars.
Holy smokes. Oh, Roxy, you never think small, do you?
You got to dream big, right? It gives you something to reach for.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Well, we will look for that, I know. What's an experience or class at TW that impacted you the most?
I think probably the research study we did. There was one study we did that was a 12-week study. So it's a very long study, and it was in the gym at TWU, and it was looking at these protein supplements. So whether taking a casein supplement, which is a slow digesting milk protein source, earlier in the day versus later in the day would affect how muscle is built or maintained. And yeah, I think I just learned from that um, the rigors of research and how it can feel like you honestly live and breathe your research study at times. But it was also great because you get to know your participants when you're working with them for that long, and so it's a great experience to learn, both how hard research can be and how demanding of a schedule it can be, but also that the people you're working with are not just subjects, they're also people, and you get to know them on a personal level. So yeah.
I think that's the project where I brought you coffee to keep you going.
Yeah, luckily there was the Starbucks at the library at that time, so that was a daily event.
Oh, wow. What advice might you give to those going into jobs or fields like yours?
I think kind of what we've touched on before, just getting as much experience and um, hands-on experience as you can before. So whether it's working with athletes or working with clients, just in a nutrition field, or doing research in any way you can get involved, like volunteering with some of the PhD students. Even, Sarah Deemer was here asking questions. I would volunteer to help out with some of her work over in the exercise physiology lab, just so you can see what other people are doing, and, see what materials they're using, what equipment they're using, and learn that way. So, yeah.
I think it's so important to get involved. I strongly encouraged all of our master students in the sports nutrition program to do a thesis so that they could get their hands into research, so they could get their noses into the literature and get their hands dirty. And I just don't think there's any greater teacher than the research experience. So glad you took that to heart. Well, oh, Dr. Broughton's here. Though they are much lower, have you thought about doing all the 14ers in the US, especially having spent time in Colorado? Dr. Broughton and I are both from Colorado. I've done a few of them, and I think he has too.
Yeah, good to see you here, Dr. Broughton. Yeah, so I did train on a bunch of the 14ers in Colorado when I was living there for 4 years. I did mostly the Front Range because it was close to Denver where I was living at the time, very accessible. I have thought about going back and doing all, 54 or 56, depending on how you define it, all of the 14ers. So it's definitely not out of the question. I just have to find the right time to do it. I know there are also records involved with like doing all of the 14ers in the fastest amount of time or on a bike and crazy things like that. So who knows? Maybe I'll find some fun project to incorporate that.
My favorites were in the collegiate range, Yale and Harvard.
Or the ones where you can do like all the 5 in one day, the Lincoln,
Yeah.
Democrat, Bross, Cameron.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. I think that was our last question. So
hello again. Oh, that was so wonderful hearing you guys talk about all this and such an inspiring story. And I love how you guys were able to talk about just how you connected, and I loved it. Loved it. Some great questions from everyone. So we are wrapping up. Is there any last minute things that you all would like to say? Yeah.
Well, I have recently retired, and now I'm following my other passions in gardening and helping those who are less fortunate. So I think they'll put those up in the chat box. But I encourage anybody who hasn't been out to Shiloh Field, come out and volunteer, see what it's all about. It's the largest community garden in the United States, and we provide food to about 16 different food banks in Denton, and we get fresh food, fresh vegetables to people in need. And Serve Denton is another incredible organization that links all nonprofits in one place and helps those in need to come to one place and get all their needs met.
And I think from my end, I will make a small plug for if you have any interns or prospective interns in the exercise physiology or sports nutrition field, then they can reach out to me. I think we have some contact information. Exactly. But we're always in the performance lab looking for potential interns to take on. So we would love to have you, and you could get some hands-on experience. So.
Wonderful. Well, this was such a wonderful chat, and thank you to you both, Dr. DiMarco for moderating, and Roxanne for just joining us and telling us your journey and your story. It was wonderful. So thank you so much. And again, if anyone has any questions for Roxanne, her email and social can be found on the screen, or were on the screen. And please reach out. And thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Yeah. And to our audience, thank you all for joining us this evening again, and we hope you enjoyed the Test Talk. We also hope you can join us for our next alumni event, our third Thursday event in Fort Worth, coming up on October 21st at 5:30 p.m. And also keep an eye out for our new event, or for new events for the Austin, San Antonio, and Denton chapters as well. We also hope you join us on our alumni platform, Pioneer Network, where you can connect with fellow alumni, find mentors, and search job listings. And as always, keep an eye out on our social media pages and in your email to stay up to date with TWU alumni engagement. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Bye.